So basically, it works like this. Each job can be designed with certain dimensions to it. Number one, skill variety, meaning having a wide variety of skills that we need to exercise. The greater the variety, the more it holds people's interest, the more it feels meaningful to them. The same thing with task identity. We want to give people an identifiable task. So instead of saying, you need to put the bolt on the fan as part of the assembly line, we want them to put the bolt on the fan, to assemble the whole fan, and to put the fan into the computer. So it's not just one small aspect of the job. They've got an identifiable task. My job is to make sure that the fan is fully assembled and is going into the computer so that the computer will stay cool and I can do the job. We also want task significance. And task significance basically means people need to understand why that job is important. You can imagine, right, if you tell someone, here's a job, just go do it, and if they don't understand the implications of what happens if they don't do it well, or they don't understand the implications of why the job needs to be done in a certain way, we don't give them the appropriate information. And so they won't necessarily finish the job the way the job needs to be done, and so we may have more problems associated with that. When we show them the significance of their work, and we can show them in the big picture why good work at this level has a good outcome downstream, that gives people a sense of meaningfulness. So, how does this basically work? Well, skill variety, task identity, and task significance have an additive function. What that basically means is the more variety, the more task identity, the more significance to the tasks, the greater they will experience meaningful work. Does that mean that if I have no variety but I have lots of identity and significance, it doesn't work? Not at all. It's an additive function. So you can have very low variety, but if you have good identity and good significance, that does have a meaningful impact on the meaningfulness of the work that the person does. Those three items add up to give us more meaningfulness in our work. The next item on the list is autonomy. And autonomy, again, is based on giving people responsibility to do things on their own. They are allowed to work independently. And what we know is that some jobs really require people to work more autonomously, and people enjoy working autonomously, feeling like they are their own boss and they have responsibility for their outcomes. And so the more autonomy that we give them, the more they experience responsibility for their work. And taking on the responsibility for your work really is a motivating factor for people. They are not going to drop the ball. They're going to work really hard to make sure that the work gets done appropriately because it affects them. Lastly is feedback. And in the feedback, that's where people need to know, A, how well they're doing, but B, they need to actually see what's the end result of what they do. You don't want them working in a little vacuum where they do something and then they never see what the larger impact is. And this kind of goes hand in hand with task significance, but it is slightly different. Feedback is more about the entire job that I do, whereas task significance is about a specific task that I'm addressing. So feedback means I'm going to see what my work results, the results of my work activities are. And I apologize, you can see that slide, that the words in there didn't quite fit into that box. I apologize. But feedback gives us knowledge of our actual work activities. We know how well we did, we know what we did, we know what impact it's having in the big picture. So how does this basically work? We design jobs that are as high as possible on these job dimensions, as high as possible on variety, identity, significance, autonomy, and feedback. All of these things should be as high as possible. What that does is it creates a psychological state, which can shift, of course, depending on things and depending on who we are, but it creates this psychological state where we have more experienced meaningfulness of the work that we do, more experienced responsibility for the work we do, and we have clear knowledge about the results of our work activities. We know what the outcome was. We know how well we performed, and we can actually see the results of those products and services out there. The assumption is, based on this model, that when we have these critical psychological states, when all these critical psychological states are as high as possible, we end up with better personal and work outcomes. I'm much more internally motivated to do something. I have higher quality work performance. I have much more satisfaction about the job that I do, and I'm less likely to be absent or to want to leave the company. Again, because I have an intrinsically motivating job. So it really excites me, it really rewards me, and really makes me feel happy about what it is that I'm doing. Does this work in all situations? Well, not necessarily. Really, it works when people have the desire for more variety, more identity, more significance, more autonomy, more feedback. When they have a desire to grow. If you go back to that Maslow or that Alder hierarchy, it's the stuff at the very top. When I have a high desire to grow, to engage in things that will give me more self-esteem and more self-actualization, then I am way more likely to be more motivated, have better performance, better satisfaction, and lower absenteeism and turnover. It works in that situation. If we don't have a growth need strength, will it work? Probably. But it also might have the opposite effect. We don't know, right? We don't know if I push somebody to be more autonomous, or I push them to have, a variety of tasks. They may turn around and go, I don't want this job, and they might leave. It may have the opposite and intended effect for us. So part of designing these jobs, it's great to design these jobs with these dimensions to them, but we also have to recognize that not all our employees want autonomy and significance and identity and variety, et cetera, et cetera. So we recognize that there may be some circumstances where this feels really good, but it really kind of requires the employee to want to have meaningful work and to have more responsibility and to have all this kind of knowledge. Some people like to come in at 9:01 and leave at 4:59 from their job, and they work to live. They don't live to work. So for them, they may not be excited about, having a lot of autonomy and responsibility in their job. It just doesn't mean a lot to them. Hopefully, our employees are driven by that. And I would say probably most employees these days are driven by these sorts of things, but not all. So be aware of that. But the higher the growth need strength, the higher the desire to have more self-esteem and more self-actualization, the more likely we are to see these results pop, that we're going to see more internal motivation and better performance and things like that. We move on now out of the content theories and more into the process theories. How does motivation actually work? How do we actually start to see how those things that we say motivate people actually work? Because again, you could put a reward in front of me and tell me, this is a reward that's going to work for you and you should, like this reward, and yet I look at it and go, that's not a reward that works for me. In terms of those content theories, it's not something I'm interested in. So, okay. So how does it actually work? What's the process that goes on in people's heads so that we get a better sense of, how does that actually come about? So, how do we go from there? Number one, the first one we're going to look at is equity theory. The next one is what we call expectancy theory. So, equity theory basically argues that we are always interested in looking at the relationship between our work efforts and our rewards in relationship to a referent other. Okay, whoever that other is. And there's all sorts of different others. The others could be me in the past, the other could be me at a different job, it could be my boss, it could be my colleagues, it could be a subordinate that I have, it could be my friend who works in another company. So that other can be just about anybody or anything. But I'm comparing my workload and my rewards as compared to someone else's workload and reward. And it's a ratio analysis, and we want to see is that ratio is an alignment. That if I work X, I get a certain reward, and if the other person works X times 2, they should get that reward times 2. So you can see how those proportions need to stay in alignment. When it's out of proportion, that's what drives us to resolve the inequity, the sense of unfairness. I say this all the time. Children know almost from the time they can talk and walk what is fair and what is not. And you hear this from 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, right? That's not fair. So you've got, the older sibling has 2 cookies and the younger sibling has 1 cookie. Mom had to decide how to distribute 3 cookies to 2 kids. The older sibling thinks I should get 2 because I'm the older sibling. The younger sibling says you should make it 1.5 each because just because I'm the younger sibling doesn't mean that you're more important or you deserve more cookies than I do. So you can see how every person, depending on their perspective, depending on their point of view, are going to see what is fair very differently. It is very personal. It's very much based on someone's perceptions and their self-perceptions. So, how does it basically work? Well, you will set up a formula, and you can say, well, I work 200 and I get a reward of 500, and my neighbor I think only works 200 but they got a reward of 800 or 900. So how does that work? It's out of whack. Why are they getting more of a reward than me? And there's a whole lot of different reasons why I might say that there is something that's not fair. It could be because I've been told that the reward that that person got is more than what I got, and in which case then if I think they work as hard as I do and but they got a better reward, that's a problem for me because I should get the same reward as them, right? So if we think that our colleagues who do the same work as us are being paid more, we're going to turn around and say that's not fair. So what can we do about that? One thing I could do is I could go to my boss and say, I need a raise, right? I mean, that's an absolute option. The other thing I could do is, particularly if my boss says, well, no, you're not being paid more or less and I'm not giving you a raise, I could quit. Resolves the equity problem as well. So I could leave the company and it's not an issue. But there are other factors. I mean, so it might change my behavior a little bit. I could say I could ask the reward. Another thing that I could do is slow down my work output. If I don't think my reward is in proportion to the work that I'm doing compared to my colleague who does the same work as I do, I might slow down and say, I'm not getting I'm not getting a big reward, so why should I work this hard? And so you start to slow down your work output. And you say, well, now it's in alignment. Now I'm working as hard as I think I should compared to the reward I'm getting. The other thing you could do is make a psychological shift where I could say, wow, maybe I'm not working as hard as I thought I was, and maybe I need to work harder. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to work harder. I'm going to realign the way that I think about my work and work harder so I get the reward that I want. Right? You might look at your colleague and your colleague probably is doing more work that you weren't aware of, and suddenly you become aware of the fact that they're doing more work than you thought. So you have to do a shift in your own head, psychologically speaking, to say, wow, I do need to do more work, right? Or someone might turn around and say to me, that person might turn around and go, oh no, here's my paycheck. I'm not making more than you, I'm making less than you. In which case then your equity is restored and may actually, make you feel like maybe you're working too hard, and you're getting too much of a reward. Of course, no one ever feels like they're being overpaid. We are more likely to react to an underpayment than we are to an overpayment. Very few people will actually turn around and say, I'm being paid too much for what I do. Their argument is everybody else needs to be paid at the same rate I am. That's their motivation. It's really never about, I'm going to give this reward back because I'm overpaid. It's about, no, everybody else shouldn't be in alignment with the way I'm being paid. Again, we can change the way we think about the reward. We can change our behaviors. Some of them are good processes, or good behaviors, or good outcomes, and some of them are not so good. Again, we're deciding to quit, if we don't know for sure that there's a mismatch in the rewards, or, making the decision to slow my work output down. Again, if I'm not really sure that this is a real inequity situation. It's about how I perceive it, right? So I really need some facts. I need some reality. I need to know for sure, whether or not I'm being over or underpaid before I take some rash actions in order to make that happen. And we could talk a little bit more about equity theory, in class so people have a better clarity around that. So in the next theory we're going to talk about, which is expectancy theory, we're getting at a couple of questions here as well. How do we become motivated? Does that motivated worker then become a high performer necessarily? And that's not always necessarily the case. And ultimately, will that high performer be satisfied? There is this baseline assumption that satisfied workers are more motivated, and that actually is not true. Motivated workers are more satisfied, right? if I have a situation where my worker is very motivated, they're actually a good and high performer, in the end, that drives satisfaction. Satisfaction and happiness doesn't drive motivation and performance, not in that way. So it's really important that we get the direction in which these things occur. The person has to be motivated. Then the person has to be actually succeed at the tasks that they're setting out to do. And then ultimately, assuming that I can get the good task and get a good reward, I'm ultimately going to be satisfied with that reward. And this is where, equity theory sort of influences expectancy theory to some extent, making sure that my reward is fair, that I feel good about it.